Hello everyone, it's Nina and welcome back to my channel. Today I thought I would go ahead and show you some of my favorite books I've read so far in 2023. Is this necessarily the best time of year to be putting out this video? Not necessarily. We obviously are far past the halfway point in the year, which is when I normally would put up a video like this. But I've just read so many good books this year, so I thought I would do a video now as kind of like a preview for some of the books that I'm going to be including in probably my best books of the year at the end of December. And we still have 4 months to go before the end of the year, so hopefully I can find even more great books to add to this list. But I do have quite a lot of books to show you, so I'm going to go ahead and jump into the video. We're going to go roughly by genre for this video. So my first category is going to be my adult fantasy. And the first books I want to talk about are the 3rd and 4th volumes of The Grandmaster Demonic Cultivation by MXTX. These are Danmei, which is Chinese boys love. And this series follows our main character Wei Wuxian, who basically, like the title says, is the Grandmaster of Demonic Cultivation, who was feared and hated even after his death. However, he is reincarnated into the body of this random guy who sacrifices his soul so Wei Wuxian can live again. And originally, Wei Wuxian is just planning on laying low and enjoying this new life, but he ends up running into someone from his past life who was Lan Wangji, and basically gets swept up into this big murder mystery that is taking the cultivation world by storm. These volumes are the ones where it feels like everything fits together really well and nothing feels like fluff. I love seeing all of the past timeline interactions, particularly with the characters of Wei Wuxian and Zhongtang, but I also really like seeing the main character Wei Wuxian as he gets a little bit more off-kilter and kind of starts becoming the vengeful Grandmaster Demonic Cultivation that we hear so much about in the beginning of the series. In 2023, I ended up finishing this series. I read the 3rd, 4th, and 5th volume, and definitely my favorite was the 3rd volume, which I gave 5 stars, and then slightly behind that was the 4th volume, which I gave 4.5 stars. This series is incredibly popular for a reason, and I definitely think if you're interested in it at all, you should go ahead and check it out. The next book we were going to be talking about is Silver Under Nightfall by Pekko. This is a adult fantasy that follows our main character Remy, who is a vampire hunting noble who is rumored to be a dampire, which is a half human, half vampire. He ends up having to join forces with these 2 leaders of the vampire courts to stop the spread of this more monstrous zombie type of vampire that is threatening both humans and vampires alike. In my notes to talk about this video, I literally just wrote screaming, crying, throwing up, because this book I love so much that it's actually kind of difficult for me to talk about. If anything tops this as my favorite book of the year, I will honestly be shocked. Here's just kind of like a random list of things I really enjoy about this book. It has some of my favorite but quite niche tropes. The first is that there's kind of like a magical military setting. Remy is part of an order of vampires called the Reapers, who are very entrenched in a lot of like political drama and have a lot of secrets. There's also a lot of like R&D fake science stuff, which I really love in a fantasy setting. Overall, I just love Remy as a main character. I really love his backstory. Remy has this history of sexual coercion, but it kind of plays out in that he doesn't really realize he was abused. But at the same time, you can see how that abuse is really coloring all of his expectations for how relationships are supposed to go. And then it's also actively impacting his attempts to form new relationships over the course of the story. And in terms of those new relationships, he ends up becoming a throuple with the 2 vampires from the courts, who is Zhao Dan and Zidane. And I just love all of them so much. I like each character individually, but then they all fit together so well. And also for a book that I think has surprisingly little smut, the sexual tension is like all the way up to the top, that it had me ready to like gnaw off my own arm from the slow burn of it all. This book really has everything. I really love the romance aspects. I think it has really good action scenes that don't like leave me feeling bored. I think the world building and the overall plot is really interesting. And I'm super excited to read the second half of the duology that comes out in 2024. This book, I can also not stress enough how Castlevania it is. There's even a inclusion of a "what a terrible night for a curse" type of line that even me as a non-Castlevania fan was able to clock as a reference. This book is really for the gays that wanted the Castlevania anime to have a canonical throuple in it. So I highly recommend it to anyone, but specifically people who are fans of that series. The last book in my adult fantasy category is Gideon the Ninth by Tamsa. This is a adult sci-fi fantasy hybrid that follows our main character Gideon, who is an indentured servant of the Ninth House. And she is contracted to become the cavalier for the heir of the Ninth House, who is Harrowhark. The pair are summoned to go to the first house, along with the heirs of all the other 9 houses. And they are there to compete to become lictors, which are basically these like immortal, all-powerful servants of the Emperor. It starts off as simple challenges, but soon leads to a murder, with Gideon and Harrow learning to trust one another for survival. I really love a scenario that's a bunch of people who don't trust each other, then forming bonds and joining forces in a weird found family in the face of adversity. I feel like the world is very vibrant and interesting, but it's really drip fed to you in a way where it doesn't get overwhelming, which is something I really just like in a lot of adult fantasy. This is a book that I read both as an audiobook, which is narrated by Moira Quirk, and I also read a lot of sections physically. And I think either version is a really good way to read the book, but I really like both versions, so I think either way is a great way to go about reading the series. Now let's move on to the YA fantasy that I really enjoyed this year. The first one of those is Howl'S Moving Castle by Diane Wynne Jones. This is the origin for the beloved Studio Ghibli movie, where our main character Sophie gets turned into an old woman by the jealous Witch of the Waste, and then seeks out the wizard Howl to help lift her curse. The audiobook by Jenny Sterlin is also really great. I really like the fact that she gives Howl a Welsh accent because I really think it adds a lot to making him jump off the page and also have some of the jokes he tells land a little better. Overall, this book is just so fun and whimsical and cute. I think a big thing for me is I really prefer the characterization of Sophie and Howl in the book versus the movie. I just feel like Sophie in the book is really dynamic and a very fun character to follow, and maybe has just like less Mary Sue qualities compared to her movie version. If you like the movie version of Howl'S Moving Castle, then definitely check out the book, but if you've never seen the movie, then I can say that the book was better. The next book we are going to be talking about is The Ballad of Never After by Stephanie Garber. This is the second book in the Once Upon a Broken Heart series. It's also set in the same universe as the Caraval series, and it follows our main character Evangeline, who makes a deal with the Prince of Hearts, Jack, to help her save her first love. However, she quickly falls into a much larger political game surrounded by lies and betrayal. In this book, it's mostly following Evangeline helping out Jax, finding these kind of like magical MacGuffin stones to fulfill a prophecy and lift some curses that were placed on her in the previous book. I kind of can't really explain in a lot of detail why I like this book. It's really just a vibe because like the characters aren't necessarily amazing. The plot can get confusing in like trying to figure out what I'm supposed to be focusing on, but I feel like there's something really addictive in this book series that results in me just kind of like twirling my hair, kicking my feet when I'm reading this book. I feel like this book really at its heart is like invoking this kind of teenage girl nostalgia or mindset that I haven't really gotten into with a lot of other YA books, both also when I was a teenage girl and even now when I'm reading YA. I feel like it's like nostalgic for a feeling I don't know I necessarily ever experienced before myself, but it's overall just like a really pleasant vibe to dive into. And overall, I just really like Stephanie Garber's writing style. I feel like she just has a really unique, whimsical way of writing, both in like her sentence structure and also just like in the imagery that she invokes throughout her series. I'm very excited to finish off the last book in the series when it comes out in October. The next fantasy series I want to talk about is the Folk of the Air series by Holly Black. This is a YA fantasy series that follows our main character Jude, who is a human that lives in the Fae world. She has been ruthlessly bullied by Prince Cardan and his clique, but she gets the chance to prove herself when she's given the opportunity to become a spy for Cardan's older brother, right before the crowning of their new king. I still have to read the final third book in the trilogy, but overall the series is just so action-packed and fast-paced. Jude is just like that bad bitch, strong female character that we deserve, and I love her. Everyone is always like, OMG, Cardan is my book boyfriend, but honestly for me, Jude Duarte is my wife, and I will hear no words to the contrary. I think overall I preferred the first book a little bit more than the second book, just because the second book is nothing but action, 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 but it's also like Jude having like absolutely no good luck throughout the entirety of the book, and it was a little bit more stressful to read. But I am very excited to read the last book of the series and see where everything ends up. This is definitely one of those really popular book talk books that definitely deserves all the hype that it gets. Speaking of another Fae-based YA fantasy book, the next book on this list is An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson. This is a YA fantasy that follows Isabel, who is the best painter of her time, who is commissioned to paint a portrait of the Fae Prince of Autumn. But when she completes it, the prince is furious with her because she painted a human emotion in his expression, which makes him look weak to other Fae. So he ends up kidnapping her to travel to stand trial in his court. But really, the book is much more about them traveling together and bonding and unraveling some ancient Fae magic to start a new future for humans and Fae alike. Margaret Rogerson is probably one of my favorite YA fantasy authors. After completing this book, I have now read her entire backlist. Overall, everything she writes is just so well designed. Like, so many small plot details that are sprinkled in throughout the books will loop back around in the climax and end up making it hit so hard. This is definitely the most vibe-focused, like, classic fairy tale of all of her books. But it's honestly shocking that it's a debut for how good it is. And I also feel like this is the perfect fall time book, so now is the perfect time of year to be reading it. Okay, now let's move into some of the contemporary books that I've read this year. The first one in this category is Carrie Soto is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is a historical book, if you can consider the 90s to be historical. It follows a famous women's tennis player named Carrie Soto, who comes out of retirement to uphold her world record when a younger, bright star threatens to overtake her and break her title. This book made me care about sports, and if you're doing that, you must be doing something good. Even for me, who doesn't know like any tennis terms, I was still able to like play out the matches in my head and picture everything, and that was able to help me keep like the tension of the scenes going. This book has a lot of really interesting layered themes talking about like grief, ambition, love, fame, and the acceptability of female rage. It's a really complex book, and I think that also comes from the fact that every single one of the characters feels like a real person. I really loved the romance aspect of this book. I loved Carrie and Beau as a couple. I also really loved the father-daughter relationship that really is at the heart of this book. It also helps that we follow these characters for a long period of time, so throughout the years we can kind of see their development as people. I was not really super enamored with Taylor Jenkins Reid writing style when I read a previous one of her books, so I'm really happy that I really enjoyed this one, and I definitely am considering reading more of her books in the future now. The next contemporary book I have is a YA book, and that is Imogen, Obviously, by Becky Albertalli. This is a YA queer contemporary that follows Imogen, who is like a capital A ally in her all-queer friend group. While she is visiting her best friend in college, she ends up developing a crush on a girl she meets there named Tessa, which throws Imogen down a spiral of thinking she might be bi, and kind of trying to figure out how you even recognize if you are queer. This book is fantastic. It's such a thoughtful and nuanced look at how queerness exists in today's society, and how teens are dealing with finding their own identity and place in the world. I really love Becky Albertalli's writing style. I previously had read her in a book she co-wrote with another author, and I feel like this just solidifies that we have very similar tastes in like the terms of writing style and humor delivery that she does in her books, and me enjoying this definitely has encouraged me to read more of her backlist. I've often have recommended Felix Ever After as like a book I would give a teen in today's society to see what it's like being a part of the queer community, and I kind of think this book has overtaken that spot just because it's a little bit more current in references to Gen Z culture, but I also just feel like this is a good book that like any teen should read, queer or not. Overall, this book is hilarious and poignant. If you don't like authors using their characters as mouthpieces, then this isn't for you, but for me, I was like, I can't believe there's a YA book that goes there. Okay, now we're going to move on to the last category, which is nonfiction books. The first one of those is Cultish by Amanda Montel. This is a nonfiction book that talks about cults, duh, but not just in the way you would traditionally imagine them to be. It's more so broadening the definition to talk about the power of language and how so many aspects of our lives are touched by cultish tendencies in the way of speaking and meaning making. I think this book performs really well because it has both like the more like academic study of cults, but it also has a more personal subplot as Amanda Montel, her father escaped from a cult when he was younger, so she kind of has this history and fascination with them that came from him. I would honestly consider this a must-read for any internet-connected person in today's day and age. And the last book on this list is Sellout by Dan Ozzy. This is a nonfiction book that goes through many of the emo, punk, and alt-rock groups that were purchased by major labels in the 90s and early 2000s, and how their first major label album was created, its reception, and the follow-up work. Plus, it talks about overall questioning of what is the secret sauce that makes something a hit. I think this book is just really interesting. As someone who loves parts of the genre, but in retrospect, I didn't get kind of really immersed in emo and alt-rock until well past my teen years, this book becomes a really great primer for all of the bands that are included. I think music nonfiction is just a really interesting subgenre overall, and I definitely want to find more music nonfiction books that talk about these genres as well. So that is a look at all of my favorite books of 2023 so far. This year I feel like I've just been finding so many new favorites, and I'm really glad I read all of them. I definitely will have a part 2 of this video at the end of the year once I've finished all of my reading for 2023, and we'll talk then about my top favorites for all of my books throughout the year. But that is going to be it for this video today. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking this video or subscribing if you aren't already. Consider following me on the story graph, which is linked in my description if you'd like to see my reading updates in real time. And that is going to be it for me. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!